welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Adam Scott Bellos, founder and CEO of the Israel Innovation Fund, and your host for this evening. What's going on in the streets of the Middle East? Well, we're here to discuss all of that. Tonight's hot topic, the U.S.-Israel alliance and the future of the Middle East. Now, despite the strong bond between the United States and Israel, there have been tensions and disagreements between the two countries throughout their relationship. During the Obama administration, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Obama administration would begin to publicly go head-to-head on a fundamental disagreement in their worldviews over the Iran deal. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected to office and a major shift occurred. His administration withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal and brokered the peace agreements known as the Abraham Accords between Israel and several Arab states. These agreements have been seen as a breakthrough in the region and have raised hopes that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict may be resolved by incorporating Saudi Arabia and the Palestinians into the Abraham Accords. With the election of Joe Biden in 2020, the U.S. has sought to return to the Obama administration's former approach to the region, especially with Iran. In addition, most recently, China brokered a peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a shock to the region, potentially weakening the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia and possibly preventing a future peace deal with Israel. And that, my friends, brings you up to speed. Tonight, we have two very special guests to discuss the relationship between the United States and Israel and the new Chinese brokered treaty between Iran and Saudi Arabia. On my left is Emily Schrader, journalist at Ynet and founder of the political marketing firm Social Light Creative. And on my right, Fleur Hassan Nahum, deputy mayor of Jerusalem, founder of the UAE Business Council and the Gulf Women's Forum.
Gulf Israel Women's Forum.
Gulf Israel Women's Forum. Fleur is quickly becoming known as one of the greatest spokespeople for the state of Israel. So, guys, very interesting week in terms of comments that have been made not only by the U.S., but also from Israel to the U.S. Most recently, President Biden was quoted saying that he's a very strong supporter of Israel, but he's very concerned about the judicial reforms and that he hoped that Benjamin Netanyahu would act in a genuine way to create compromise. Personally, it seems like we always make such a big deal out of any public spat that kind of happens, whether or not it's big or small. Somehow it's always turned into this doom or gloom situation with the special relationship. Fleur, would you agree that this is kind of overblown? It's just, I would say, Biden responding to something on the tarmac, probably while he's got 20 different things going on, also thinking about a re-election campaign?
Well, I think yes and no. On the one hand, everything, as I keep saying, everything to do with Israel gets amplified. It doesn't matter what it is. So judicial reforms gets amplified. When you have strikes of 1 million people in France, nobody even blinks an eyelid. And when you have Biden making a comment that seemingly seems a little hostile to Netanyahu, it gets blown up. Why anybody was even asking him about that when he was on the tarmac going to Poland is a whole other story, when Poland is a country that, not exactly known for its rights and freedoms. And so we always have an element of that. But I can tell you, as somebody who has a warm and very, very positive relationship with the embassy, the American embassy in Jerusalem, and with the ambassador personally, professionally, there's always going to be disagreements, but there's so much that we're doing together, that we're working on together, that we're building on together. And it's extremely, extremely important for Israel to always remain in good relations with the United States. I don't buy this that we don't need them. Yes, we do. We need to have a positive relationship with the United States for many different reasons. And it's not for the military aid, because that's very mutual, but it's also for the fact that the Americans in the UN, in the International Criminal Tribunal, in all of these international bodies that are constantly looking to malign and delegitimize, they are our number one friend and ally, and let's not forget it. And so, yes, is it overblown? Yes, is it our obligation to keep a positive relationship? Absolutely, but Israel also has to make its own sovereign decisions. But we must always bear in mind that this relationship is key for us.
Emily, what do you think? Overblown, or is this like a realistic problem for the future?
So I do think it's been overblown in how it's been reported in the international community. Of course, I agree with Flora on that front. That being said, I do think that there are major tensions that haven't existed, perhaps, well, especially in the previous administration, but also before. That being said, it's certainly not the worst situation that the U.S. and Israel have been in. The relationship will continue. It should continue. And I do agree that it's definitely strong, not something that's going anywhere. But what I want to talk about when it comes to Joe Biden is the fact that people are asking him questions about Israel and our internal protests here instead of asking him about the Iran deal and the situation with Iran and his complete lack of international leadership when it comes to this issue. Any conversation about Israel isn't even really relevant to what's happening in the global world today. And I think that is the bigger issue that needs to be covered in the international press.
It's interesting what Emily's saying, because in America, the #1 hot topic is Trump and the indictment. In Israel, the #1 hot topic going around the world are the judicial faults. Meanwhile, the whole world's turning upside down. China's brokering deals with Iran and Saudi. Russia is becoming a major key player. And everybody's focused on these two personalities, you know, and that is more concerning, that everybody's eye is off the ball instead of being where it should be. And that is in these new kind of dangerous regional alliances.
Well, don't you guys think, though, that now, I guess you could say, now that China has done what they've done with Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also the failure to restart the JCPOA, doesn't it seem like Iran, the United States and Israel are headed towards the same direction now? Because if you think about the last 10 or 15 years of foreign policy towards Iran from the United States, it's been kind of a blunder, so to speak. Would agree, disagree? I mean,
so I wouldn't actually agree with that. I think the way that Trump handled
outside of the Trump administration's reversal.
Yeah. Well, the U.S. administration has been very weak when it comes to Iran for quite a while. Obama was definitely not the strongest, and unfortunately, we've seen after Trump was actually tough on Iran, we've seen sort of a reversal with what Biden has done. I don't think at all that they're going in the same direction. I think that
you don't see any type of realignment even after the.
I don't, because even yesterday in the news they were talking about how the United States is discussing releasing money, freezing sanctions in exchange for Iran freezing their nuclear program, which we know is not going to happen. Even if they say it will, we know it's not going to. And yet this administration and Rob Malley, the special envoy for Iran, are continuing to push this narrative that there is something to negotiate with Iran. There is nothing to negotiate with a terrorist mafia regime, period.
Absolutely. Killing its own people, killing its own women on the streets. Talk about shared values. It couldn't be more opposite than shared values with the United States. And yet why this desperation to try and cut a deal? What they should be aiming for is regime change.
Well, don't you think that this is somewhat of a public display of a lack of confidence in the American administration today? Because, I mean, China has not, I cannot remember the last time China brokered any type of peace treaty in recent history. And the fact is that the U.S. does have this extremely strong long-term relationship with Saudi Arabia, very similar to Israel. And now all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia is creating a peace treaty with one major global superpower that's an adversary to the United States, and two, Iran, who does consider the United States to be the bigger Satan of the two Satans between Israel and the United States.
Well, from what my sources tell me, Saudi and Iran pretty much brokered the deal by themselves, and they brought in China as a poke in the eye to the United States. That's what my sources tell me. I'm not sure, how true that is, but it would make sense because America has kind of retreated a little bit from the region, including Saudi.
I think that this is a strategic mistake. The entire peace agreement, if you can even call it that, a normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi is definitely a rejection of the U.S. position in international foreign policy, especially as it comes to Iran. It's definitely a symbol that I think the Saudis don't really trust the U.S. And frankly, under the Biden administration, why should they? The blunders with Afghanistan, the way that he's handled Iran, there is no reason to trust the Biden administration. And I've been the #1 critic, despite the fact I'm American and I love the U.S.-Israel relationship. But but this administration has failed abysmally at dealing with the global export of terrorism from Iran and at facilitating any sort of productive discussion when it comes to peace agreements. I hope that despite that, Israel can continue to move forward with a peace agreement with Saudi. I don't think it excludes that.
That's my biggest
I don't think it excludes that.
I agree with Emily. I don't think that this excludes. That's the first thing that everybody panicked about.
But how could it not?
No, because you have to understand, just because Iran and Saudi have signed a deal, it doesn't mean they love each other.
100%.
So I mean, they're still fighting a proxy war in Yemen, let's not forget.
But wasn't this agreement put in place in order to start winding that down? Or
yes, but these types of agreements have happened between Saudi and Iran before, and it hasn't actually followed through. So we kind of need to see how the next few months play out.
So is this just a publicity stunt in order to say to the Americans, it's time to get your priorities in check? We need to go back to Obama's big change in approach was leading from behind, whereas President Trump's approach was the exact opposite. So is this...
I think in the Middle East, the concept of leading from behind is absolutely non-existent.
That was I know you, and I know that was the nicest way that you could say that. Without question, yeah. No, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I just think that the entire situation is a reflection of bad foreign policy on the part of the Biden administration.
Only the Biden administration, or also, I mean, because
this is a
Saudi Arabia
continuation
seems to be
of the ideology of Obama, and obviously, Biden was the vice president of Obama,
which is a failed policy.
It is a failed policy, and we've seen that wherever it is promoted internationally, there are mass casualties, there are human rights violations, there's an absolute disaster, like what we see today throughout the Middle East because of Iran. And the West continues, not just the United States, the West continues to not hold Iran accountable, and that's unacceptable.
You know, the only hope I have, and maybe Emily will agree with me, is that the Iranian community in America have kind of woken up with what's going on at the moment. I don't know whether you agree. And they're really putting pressure for the first time very seriously on the American government against signing a deal. And I wonder what type of effect that will have on what they're talking about now, an interim deal.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what happens with that. But I do think that the Iranian people in the diaspora in the United States have been much more vocal about what's happening now on the ground. And you've also seen a decline of organizations that are allied in some capacity or another with the regime itself, like NIAC, the lobbying groups that are working in the service of the government of the Islamic regime in Iran have become less and less prevalent because the Iranian people are standing up and saying, no, we want nothing to do with those people. They don't represent us. We want a free and democratic Iran.
The question is, who's going to get up and stand with the people of Iran and help topple this regime in a serious way? And apart from Israel, who vocally come out saying that this is what we need to do, we need more allies, because people are dying every single day. Women are being killed on the street, raped in prisons, and nobody seems to blink an eye, except instead they're particularly worried about judicial reform in Israel.
So that brings me to two things that I want to bring up. One is the human rights situation because of who's involved in this treaty, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia. But also, I just find it very interesting what the two of you were talking about in terms of the Iranian community and the diaspora, specifically in the United States. And one of the reasons that people have always blamed the United States for having such a strong relationship with Israel is because of the strength of what people refer to as the Jewish lobby. And now we're seeing the emergence of an Iranian-American lobby, but it is somewhat split, if I'm correct, between pro-regime and anti-regime, or is it mostly anti-regime?
I don't know any pro-regime.
There are organizations that are lobbying the State Department on behalf of the regime.
Plants.
Yeah, there are people who have had sinister associations with the regime for many, many years. That's what I'm saying, that they've sort of been called out and rejected more so publicly than ever before. So there's not very many. It's a minority of people, like literally a handful of people.
How important is it for the Iranian Americans to start organizing and lobbying the way the Jewish community has in the last 50 years?
Well, I don't think it's just the Iranian community. I mean, I've been speaking about this issue since this wave of protests began. And I've said from day one that everyone who is a citizen of a democratic country, any democratic country, should be writing, should be calling, should be emailing their legislators to pressure them to designate the IRGC as a terror organization in the United States, to pass the Massa Act, to push for a stronger approach, for stronger sanctions on Iran.
And to cut diplomatic ties and any type of business with them, including all the Europeans. You know, as long as people keep giving this regime oxygen, they will keep killing their own people. And if this is what they're doing to their own people, God help us.
I actually think that was one of the smartest things that the Trump administration did, was put new sanctions back on the Iranian regime, which nearly crippled them
It nearly crippled them,
the
and it's a
economy
shame
was
it didn't
reopened.
have more time to finally cripple them, and then people would have taken over. The army would have, you know, decided what their fate is, and we may have seen regime change by now, but let's see.
I want to talk a little bit about the human rights situation, okay? Because when I saw this treaty a few weeks ago being publicly presented, I said, oh, look, they're the 3 greatest human rights violators in the world making a treaty. I mean, to me, I think as just an independent thinker and observer, I said this is the most hypocritical, you know, ridiculous thing that I could ever see, because it's obviously fake. It's obviously some type of poke in the eye or a message to the United States. It was also a subtle message to Israel. How is there, I mean, maybe I'm just being very naive right now, but how is there no actual international opposition to China brokering some type of agreement like this, even if they were just brought in to be somewhat of a fly on the wall to annoy the United States?
Well, first of all, I would say that Saudi Arabia under MBS is really making an effort to move a very, very traditional community that has been seeped in kind of Islamic fundamentalism because of their own failed policies for the last 30 years with empowering the Wahhabis, etc. But ultimately, he's really a modern monarch, really trying to move a very large population, a very traditional population.
Which you have to give him credit for.
So you have to, absolutely have to give him credit for. Let me tell you, if he hadn't given the go-ahead to Bahrain, for example, they would never have made peace with Israel.
Yep.
He nodded and said, go ahead, because he understands that in the future, the Middle East, even now, is realigning itself into the countries that want peace and prosperity for their people and the countries that want destruction and pulling us back 500 years. And he understands which side he has to be on. They announced yesterday that they're building a new startup city, NEOM.
The vertical city, correct?
Well, it's like a
It's part of their
smart city
2030
on
vision,
speed.
right.
And let me tell you, there's a few Israeli companies very much involved there, quietly helping build the thing. And this is what we saw before the UAE agreement with Israel. There's a precursor of kind of under-the-radar normalization. So that's going on. And that is thanks to MBS's vision that he wants to move his country along. Now, this he's doing for other reasons, and I don't think one takes away from the other, although I think that we need to do better towards that path.
So do you think this is it for the Saudi Arabians and the United States? Or again, it's
No, I mean, with a different administration, I think you're going to see a different reality. It's impossible to know what will happen at this point, but that also is a long-standing relationship with the United States, and I'm sure that those ties will be a little bit more mended in, you know, a future administration, whether it be left-wing or right-wing.
Well, we're
depends
possibly
what's
looking
happening.
at a change in administration in less than 2 years.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
and if you listen to what either DeSantis or Nikki Haley is saying, they want to return to the Trump administration's foreign policy towards Iran. So, I mean, this flip-flopping, strengthening and weakening of this regime, I mean, it's causing some regional turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't place the blame for regional turmoil on the United States, and whoever the president is, I would place it on Iran, who is the biggest murderer of Arab Muslims in all of the Middle East.
Exactly.
Something that is lost in all of the international or English-speaking media.
Are they the largest exterminator of women as well?
I don't have the statistics. I don't have the statistics.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
But as they said, they don't have gay people in Iran. So
No, they don't exist. They barely have any women either.
yeah. Yeah, it's
Certainly none with uncovered hair. No, ultimately, Emily's 100% right. The world is focused on the wrong place. We have essentially something on the levels of Hitler in Iran. And yes, and
also Syria.
And well, that's
Syria is also Iran. All
Syria
roads
is
lead
Iran.
to Tehran.
Which is something that a lot of people don't get.
Every bad guy in the world today killing their own people is Iran. Our 2 biggest terrorist groups wanting to get rid of Israel, which is Hezbollah and Hamas, are funded by Iran. You get rid of this regime, you get rid of all the export of terrorism, as well as having their people live in freedom and in peace.
Not to mention the fact you significantly weaken Russia and their aggression against Ukraine, which now Iran has inserted itself into this conflict as well. So really, Fleur is right. Everywhere we see this type of turmoil, these type of human rights violations, there is some association with the Islamic regime in Iran.
So what's the solution to fix the situation?
Regime change.
Period. End of story.
Yes.
And the only country that's standing up and saying the truth is Israel. The only man who's been saying this for 15 years is Benjamin Netanyahu. And that, the whole world should be giving him credit, because when he was talking about it 10 years ago, everybody thought he was paranoid. And look where we are today.
So do you feel that if there is a regime change, we could look at a total different landscape in the Middle East? Because
Absolutely.
But it's not something that could happen overnight.
No, revolutions take time. We've seen that already. It's been 6 months. The previous revolution took, 14 months in the Islamic Revolution. So it's to be expected that this will take time. But the day that regime falls, they'll be ready for peace with Israel. We've already seen it from a lot of the opposition leaders. Even the son of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, has made statements about how he wants collaboration with Israel to fix some of the dire issues going on in Iran, technological issues, environment issues.
The people of Iran are not our enemy. They never have been. They're actually very moderate people. They always were. They have a very toxic regime. You know, Emily, as well as I, have been very active in the space of trying to raise awareness. I'm sure Emily gets 10 times more messages than me, but I'm getting messages from people in Iran all the time saying, thank you for standing up for us. Thank you. We need you. We need you. That's what they tell us. So if we can help Iran, then, you know, the bigger powers of this world, it should be a moral obligation to help Iran.
It is a huge disappointment to see how poorly the situation has been read by the international community, because it's clearly gotten completely out of control. And when you have the type of revolution that's going on right now, specifically led by women, without some type of international blustering, it does cause the need for more activism and for more people to get involved, like you said. We only have a couple minutes left. I'd like to give you guys your final thoughts of this evening. Fleur, we'll start with you for 30 seconds. Final thoughts?
Tomorrow we are celebrating the Festival of Freedom, the festival where the Jewish people went from slavery to freedom. So it's upon us to help those countries, amongst them, of course, the #1 perpetrator of slavery of their own people and of terrorism around the world, Iran. This Seder, I want everybody to give a thought to those people who are literally fighting for their survival and for their freedom.
That's very beautiful. Emily?
Hard to top that, because I agree with every word. But I will say, just in reference to what Fleur mentioned earlier about the direction of Saudi Arabia, I want to point out that it's actually the opposite direction when it comes to Iran. And well, anytime there's a cease of conflict and lives are being saved, so if there is a cease of conflict between between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, we see them going in opposite directions. And this is something that's been missed by the international community. And if we're going to support the people of Iran who are pushing for regime change in the country, I think the entire international community needs to be honest about what's happening on the ground in Iran, and to support, whether economically or in other ways, to support regime change.
Beautifully put. I want to say thank you to my two wonderful guests this evening for discussing such an important and pertinent topic. Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan Nahum, and journalist and human rights activist Emily Schrader. Thank you to all of you watching this evening. I am Adam Scott Bellos. This is ILTV's Insider. Please tune in next time for the most interesting stories and topics surrounding Israel and the Middle East. Shalom from Israel. Stay classy. Hag Kasher Sameach. Happy Passover. And L'chaim.